Hey everyone, I'm Javis, and I'm going to show you how we create shoes using Modo with the procedural modeling tools. Of course, you'll need a couple of things, primarily a digital last and concept art that you can projection paint upon the digital last. Let's make sure that we select our digital last, and you can do so in the outline panel or the item list, or you can do it inside of the 3D viewport by clicking on it. And a couple of things we want to set up ahead of time before we can actually start painting is to import our concept art and create an image inside of Modo, as well as on disk, that we projection paint from our concept onto our designated UVs based on the digital last. So let's go ahead and set this up. First off, let's go inside of the shader tree and we'll add a new layer, go down to image map, and then say new image. And I'm going to call this projection front UV, which I've already got created here, and I made sure it's a target so that way we get our alpha channel, and make sure that is set to RGBA so we do get the alpha channel, and it only needs to be 2K. In fact, you could go lower, but we'll go 2K. The one thing we want to make sure is that its projection type is set to UV map, and that we select the correct UV. And in this case, that would be upper vamp. You could also do upper back, and then bake later to upper vamp, but we'll start with upper vamp and bake to upper back. All right, and we'll also place this outside of any material groups. Now what we need to do is to bring inside of Modo our image ink or image that we're going to project using the image ink tool. So with image ink selected, select tool properties and select the image directory that that image resides in. And if you don't have that, let's add path, go to our project directory, find the reference art, find the folder that contains the reference art, hit select folder, and then select our reference art. So now that we have that set up, what we need to do is click in the viewport with our airbrush tool, of course, and make sure that we have the object selected, the image that we're projecting to selected, and then image ink turned on with a brush tool. So select airbrush and then click in the viewport and you'll see we get our image ink there, and I'll move the shoe out of the way. All right, looking good. And now what we can do is line this up, and we'll not be messing around with the image ink itself. Instead, we'll navigate with the 3D viewport navigation tools. And the first thing we want to do is go to the side view, and I'm going to hit numerical 3 on my keyboard twice, and that will go to the left side view. And we'll line this up as best as we can. It's pretty close, so we'll only have to do a little bit of cleanup once we get it projected. And that should do right there. So now what we can do is make sure that with the tool properties selected again, that our foreground color is white. If it's not white, then it will tint the image that we're painting. So if you had a red, for example, it would paint red, and that's not what we want. So now we can paint inside of the 3D viewport. All right, and we'll hit numerical 3 again, and that will change to the right side view. Open up the tool properties panel and then flip horizontal, and it should line up perfectly if you didn't do any navigation in the 3D viewport. So now we can paint this side. And there we are. We'll turn off image ink, deactivate our airbrush tool, deselect the mesh, and not too shabby. We do got a little bit of cleanup along the seams. Edit that. For example, along the back and the front right here. It doesn't line up 100%, but that's not a problem. That's something we can paint in. Now we need to clean up the image on here because obviously it's got some distortion in the center of where we projected the painting along the front and the back. So let's go ahead and start with the front. And we'll activate the airbrush tool. And to scale our brush size down, we can click and hold the right mouse button. So we'll go to something a little small, and we'll sample one of the colors here, preferably this dark bluish gray. And you can do that by middle clicking the mouse button. Now, one thing we want to do is to make sure that everything connects up along the center. So with the projection front UV image selected, we'll go ahead and paint along the center. This does not have to be 100% accurate, but let's try and make sure it looks good and in line with the concept art. All right. Now, another thing that happened is that the center here, and I'll just draw in this area, these parts of the upper are too close. We want them to be a little bit further apart. In fact, more like where these circles are for the eyelets or the eye stays, along that area, and along more where the rings are, these purple rings are. So something like that. So what we need to do is redraw part of this area just a little bit, and we'll go ahead and manually sketch that in. Make sure we get that semi-harsh angle in there. And there's also an erase tool, so when we get there, we can erase things as needed. All right, just go ahead and sketch that in. And right about here, it curves down. Okay, now we'll do the same thing for the next side. And we'll keep in mind we're keeping that one, this one, and then we start to move down right here. Let's go and take a look. Yeah, right about there. Okay, so we'll sketch that in, get our little bend in there, and follow it on down. Do our bend here. Okay, and that's something we can play with a little bit too as we use the curves. If it's not close enough or too far away, we can just adjust our curves in 3D and ignore the concept art. But as long as we get close to what we had in our concept art, we should be good to go. Go ahead and connect up these lines here. And now we'll go ahead and either erase like so or draw in. And I tend to draw in. So let's middle mouse click one of these dark colors and go ahead and just paint in this area. That way it's not distracting for us when we're drawing in our curves to create the panels. So go ahead and paint these out. And then we'll select that dark bluish gray again and connect up the back here. Now we can brush in this area. Doesn't have to be perfect. We just want to make sure that we don't get confused when we're laying down our curves. And maybe we'll come in and fix this up a little bit because it's a little awkward. We got a bend here and a bend here, and there should be just a slight bend and more of an arc, like so. And this one actually looks pretty good, so we don't have to worry so much about that. But we will come in and maybe clean it up a little bit. All right, that should do the trick. We're not going to worry too much about the laces or the eyelets at this point. Edit that part out. Now for the eyelets and other parts, what we can do is, since we're keeping these three here more toward the back and the other three on the bottom more toward the inner portion, what we can do is paint over the upper ones just to give us a good idea of where our eye stays are going to be at. Suppose we should probably fix this toe cap and along the side here and along the opposite side as well. Undo that part there. It looks like I painted out my line. And that should do for the cleanup. Now that we have our concept art projected onto one of the UVs, which is, if we go and look at our UV maps, it's the upper vamp. And when we open up that image, you'll see that it's constrained or conformed or projected that texture to those UVs. And what we need is also a rear version of this, this texture map. applied with a different UV set. And the reason is because once we start laying down panels, for example, anything that's along the front that doesn't cross a seam will work just fine. But if we want to use the same UV set and if the curve crosses the back here across the UV seam, it won't work. So we need something that actually has no seam along the middle back as well. So let's set that up. It's a relatively easy process. And if we look at the back UVs, it's pretty similar, except it's split down the front and middle. So what we need to do, first off, is to add a new image layer. And go to image map, new layer. Okay, and we'll call this one projection back UV, also a targa, and we'll retain that alpha channel. And what we want to do here is to make sure that when we bake, that it's baking the material. So let's go and set that up now. We'll select our mesh item. And I'm going to use a selection set so that way we can retain our material tags later on and still be able to bake without having any issues with material tags. So what we want to do is bring up our selection sets, and I've got a little custom one here set up and assign selection set, and we'll call this upper last SS for selection set, and we'll say add, hit OK. And then we'll go to the baker material that we have set up here already and make sure that we go to the properties, change the poly tag type from material to selection set, and then say in the poly tag to upper last SS. Now to add a material group, if you don't have one already, go to add layer and then just select group. Okay, so now this set of polygons has that material tag. So what we can do is just drag these into that area or that group. Select the projection back UV. Make sure that it has the correct UV set, and it should, since the last UV set we had selected when we created this was the upper back. So make sure that's set in there, otherwise this won't work. And what we want to do is make sure that when we bake, that the projection back UV is above the other image map, and that's because it will bake everything below it to that image. So if it were below the front UV, it would not bake that image to the new one. So let's go ahead and right click on our back UV and then say bake to texture, and you'll see that it's baking from the front UV set to the back UV set in the new image. Now that we have that texture on the other UV set, what we need to do is flatten out our mesh so that we can use curves in a 2D space and project them into the UV space back onto this last that we have here. So let's get that going. And the way to do that is to select the last, and we'll do this in item mode, go to the texture menu, and then say convert UVs to mesh. And what we'll do is we'll select the upper vamp one first, which is the one from the front with the seam down the middle back. And hey, what do you know? Looks like I've done this before. I'm going to call this upper front UV OBJ because that's going to convert that to an object. And hit OK. And you can see now we have that UV set in a 3D but 2D space. So if we open up our UV map and take a look, you'll see it looks exactly the same. And this part of the process is very important, and it's important to also note that it lies within the 0 to 1 meter grid space. If it's not within that, it won't be in the 0 to 1 UV space. So those spaces directly correlate. Now what we need is the back UV. So let's go ahead and set that one up as well. Go up to texture, convert UVs to mesh, select the upper back, and we'll rename this to upper back UV underscore OBJ. All right, and now we have both of those UVs as objects. One of the great things about this workflow is that you can easily go back and make changes to your concept. And let's say you forgot something, for example, a tongue, and what do you know? Looks like we forgot to put that tongue in. So let's go and do that now. And what we need to do is first select one of these textures that we created here, and we'll do the same one that we did before. That would be the projection front UV. So we need to make sure that we hide the back UV. So select the front UV, select the mesh, activate the brush tool, and let's sample a color here with the middle mouse button. Make sure our brush size is appropriate, and let's go ahead and draw in our tongue. Okay, that should do. And now we know where our tongue is going to be. And we still need to make sure that it goes across to the back UV. And if we activate that one, you can see it's no longer visible because we're turning on the back UV and it's overlaying that mesh right there. And what we need to do now is bake that to the back UV. So let's go ahead, right click on the back UV texture and then bake to texture. And that will bake in our material onto the back UV. And now you can see the image here for the back. If we toggle that on and off, has the tongue. And also it is now on the flat version as well. So there you go. And that's all there is to making changes to your concept on both the front and back. All right, now we're ready to finally lay down one of our curves. And what we'll end up doing first is the panel that wraps around the back here and has the eyelets in it. So we'll wrap around from here, go on up to where the throat is, and wrap around and come back down on the other side. And we're going to need the flat back version visible for this. And we'll also go to the front view, and I did that with the numerical 2 key on the keyboard. And we also need to turn on the mesh constraints, and that's up here. And by default, it goes to background. Let's hold Alt and then click that and make sure that it's set to geometry constraint point. So we are good to go there. All right, and now what we can do is go back to the modeling tools, and we're going to be using the standard spline tool. You could use Bezier curves if you prefer, or any of the other curve tools, but I'm going to be sticking with the regular spline tools. And we also need to make sure that we create a mesh item, and I'm going to call this one CRV for curve. We'll call this back panel. All right. Okay, so now what we can do is go ahead and start by placing some points. I think I'll just start in the middle here. We need to make sure that, actually, let's go to the 3D perspective view here. We want to make sure that it tucks underneath where this mesh intersects the tooling or the midsole, just like it would on a real shoe. So we want it to go underneath that area. So what we're going to do is place it right up in here, and that looks like, yeah, based on our sketch, that looks like it should be in that area. So go ahead and make sure we wrap this curve all the way around. And we're going to follow the general contour of that. And as we get closer to this sketch line here, we're going to place a point here, one in the corner, and one there. So that way it follows that edge fairly precisely. And we can even bring that a little bit more closely to that other vert there. Okay, click on this vert again, and then we can start placing more curves along this sketch line. All right, almost halfway there. Okay, and as we get up in this area again, on the opposite side, we're going to do the same thing. We'll place a vert right here and another one right close to that as we get back into this area. And actually, let's bring that up. Oops, I'm clicking outside. There we go. Okay, we'll place this maybe up in here a little bit more, like so. And we'll spread these out because we don't need that many in that one little area. Okay. And just follow this contour along here. And now what we need to do is make this a closed curve. So let's hit Tool Properties, and then right here, click on Closed. And so now we have a curve that follows all the way around here. And we can drop the tool with the spacebar. Okay. And because we use the mesh constraints to background meshes, that curve is snapped perfectly flat to our flat version of our UVs. And that's going to be helpful once we start using this next tool. And what we're going to be doing is creating another mesh and then feeding this curve into the mesh and then using some of the procedural functions to fill that in with polygons, snap it to the surface of the last, and then do a couple other things. So let's go ahead and start that. So I'm going to create a new mesh. I'm going to call this mop for mesh op. And we'll call this back panel. And we're calling it that to match up with our curve with the same name. So one's curve back panel, the other is mop back panel. And in the mesh operators, let's widen that a little bit. Let's add an operator. And we're going to find the merge mesh operator. Add that in. Expand this arrow out, click on add source, and I'm going to type in CRV for curve because that's what I have that back panel object name to. Click on that, and now what we can do is hide our curve back panel, and you can see we still have a curve in there, and that's because we're feeding that into the mop back panel. All right, so next up in the mesh stack, what we're going to do is add in a curve fill function. We'll type in curve fill, and then hit enter. And now what we can do is hide our flats. And you can see that we've got a piece of flat geometry here. And currently that's set to use polygonal faces. Let's change that to subdivision surfaces. And I'm also going to change the fill steps. And let's go ahead and try 8. Just to see if we can get a little bit different polyflow and also a little fewer polygons. Let's try 5. I think we'll go with 5 for now. And if we need to change that, we can do it later. All right, that's looking pretty good so far. Yeah, okay. So next up, now that we have that geometry, we can add in another operator, and this one's going to be UV transform, and we'll key that in. So here's the important part. What we're doing is taking this mesh, saying, hey, here's the target mesh, which in this case is upper last, which is that mesh over there. And now what we want to do is select the UV map that we want to use as the reference from that mesh. And since we're using the upper back flat, we want to make sure that we use the upper back UV map. Otherwise, it will snap incorrectly to the surface if we use the front one. So we'll hit OK, and you'll notice if we look over here at the last, that geometry is snapping perfectly onto the last and following our contours of the concept art that we created. I say art loosely on that piece. All right, so if we hide the last and if we rotate around, you can see we've got something pretty interesting working for us here. So a couple more mesh ops that we're going to add in here. The first one is thicken. So we'll type in thicken, and let's see, we'll do, we'll try negative 0.2 for 2 millimeters. That should go inward. Yeah, 2 millimeters should work just fine. Looking good. Let's try negative 2.5 centimeters. So that's negative, sorry, I said negative 2.5. I meant negative 0.25. So we got negative 2.5 millimeters. All right, that looks good. Now what we'll do is we'll add in another operator, and this one will be bevel. We're going to do a poly bevel. And what we want to do with this is to bevel just the edges we created along here with the thicken function. And that can be done inside of the poly bevel. And what we need to do is add a selection to that. And there are several ways we can do this. The first is we could come in here and select those polygons, select a loop, and then add selection, and then set it by index. But we don't want to do that. We want to be smarter about this than just adding a selection, because if we make any changes at the beginning of the stack here, that poly bevel would need to be adjusted every time if the index of the polygons or vertices changes in the stack. So instead of doing that, we can add a selection, and what we'll do is type in previous and add a new one here, select by previous. And what that's doing is it's going to say, hey, let's go look at a previous function. And we can do that over here. So source item, we're going to call from the thicken, and then we can select the front, back, or sides of that thicken. So the original would be front, the back would be the interior, and the sides are what we want. And you can see immediately we have some results out of that. So let's go back to the poly bevel function, and let's try 0.02, 0.05. We don't want it to be too harsh. We want it to be somewhat rounded like it would be with a real piece of leather or fabric. Okay, that looks pretty good. And let's do the same thing for the shift, so it pushes it outward along that bevel. And we'll say 0.05, maybe 0.03. Yeah. So it's soft, but still has a little bit of tightness in there. All right, so that was the first panel, and that passes by pretty quickly. So let's do another one. And we have a couple of ways we can attack that. We can start out exactly as we did, make a mesh, make each one of these mesh ops, or you can duplicate this mesh, and that will keep all of the mesh ops attached to it. And I think because it passed by so quickly, let's go ahead and just create a new one from scratch. So make a new mesh item. We'll call this one CRV for curve, and we'll call this one front panel and tongue. All right, and we can now unhide our flats, but we don't need the back anymore, so we'll hide that one, unhide the front, and then make sure in the shader tree that we have that texture turned on. Okay, so back over to our item list, make sure that we have the CRV object selected. Activate the spline curve tool. Make sure your mesh constraint is turned on so that way it snaps to that background item there, which happens to be the flat version. Okay, and I'm going to go to one of our orthographic views again, and that would be the front, and that's with numerical 2. And we'll go ahead and place in the tongue and front area here. So we'll start up here, and we'll go around this direction. And we currently can't see the curve, and that's because it exists on that same plane. Sometimes it doesn't appear every time. So if you can't see that, you can go to the perspective view, and that's with the period or dot key on the numerical keypad. All right, so we'll just keep on following this on down. All right, so we have this panel right here, the toe cover, or the toe cap, and what we want to do is tuck that underneath there. So let's go ahead and bring this curve over here, and we'll make sure that it goes underneath right there, because the toe cap starts right here on this sketch line. Let's try and duplicate the amount of curves we have on the opposite side. So we had 2 over in that area. This doesn't have to be dead accurate because it's going to be tucked underneath the other panel. And now we need to make this a closed curve, so open up the tool properties, tick the closed option, and let's finesse this shape a little bit more. All right, so that should do that. Go ahead and drop the tool with the spacebar. And now we need to create some mesh ops for this. So let's go ahead and first make a new mesh item. And we'll call this one mop front panel tongue. Okay, we'll hide the curve for the same piece here. We'll add a mesh op called mesh merge, merge mesh, bring out this menu, go down to source, add source, type in CRV, and it's the front panel tongue. So now we can see we have that curve in here again. And let's add the next one, which is curve fill. Okay. It looks like I hit way too many hotkeys there. All right, so go back to the mesh shop here. And it looks like the way that I drew the curve was the opposite direction that Modo wanted. But what we can actually come in here and do is come to the curve fill and then hit flip source curve. And now you can see we have a mesh item in there being filled with polygons. So let's change the fill steps to 5 temporarily. Change the poly type to subdivision. And let's go ahead and add another operator. This one will be UV transform. And we'll do the same thing here. We're going to select the same mesh, which is upper last. But this one, we want the UV map to be upper vamp, which is the front area. So hit OK. And let's go to the 3D object here. And you can see that our mesh is filling in. But because we flipped it, it's actually facing inward. So we got another option here that we can change. And if we go back to the flip source curve, it disappears because the source curve wants it to be facing the other way. So let's go back to the original curve. Go into poly mode, then hit F for flip. And you can see right away that it's facing the right direction, and it's also populating in the on top of the last. So now let's go ahead and expand out the mesh ops for the mop version of this. And we'll go ahead and use the push tool, and we'll say negative, let's see, we'll try negative 0.2, and that should be pretty harsh, but that should work just fine. That accommodates the exact thickness that we created for the previous panel, but we don't want it to be dead precise like that. So let's go negative 0.15 centimeters, and that looks a lot better. All right, and now what we can do is add another operator, and we'll add another thicken, I'm sure you guessed, and we'll say negative 0.15. Let's go negative 0.2. All right, and now we can add another bevel, and that'll be a poly bevel. We'll go negative 0.05 and negative 0.03 on those functions. And what we still need to do inside that poly bevel, just like the previous panel, is we want to specify those border polygons, or that poly loop that was created from the thicken function. So let's go into the selection here. We'll add a selection. We'll type in previous, or begin to type in previous, make a new select by previous operation, go to source, specify the thicken, and then specify the sides. And now we have just the sides of that thicken function being beveled. All right, so now we got 2 panels complete, and a couple more panels, and we're all done with that. We could start doing the stitches, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'm sure you can see how it's coming together pretty quickly. All right, now we can work on the toe box and the heel guard. And like I was mentioning earlier, we have 2 ways we can do this. We can either duplicate some of the mesh items that we have, and that way we have all of these mesh shops here ready for us to use, or we can start from scratch. And since we already started from scratch, let's go ahead and do the duplication method. First off, we need to duplicate or create a new mesh item for our curve, so we'll just make a new one for that. Curve, and we'll go toe box. Okay, and now let's go ahead and duplicate. We'll just duplicate the front panel one. So select that, hit Control D, and we'll rename this to mop toe box. All right, and in the merge mesh, let's go ahead and remove the front panel mesh item. And now let's go into our curve toe box. Go up here to our flat version. Make sure that we have our mesh constraints turned on, activate the curve tool, and let's go ahead and place in our curve for this item. And since we have the mesh constraints on, it will snap to that surface automatically. It's also important to note we do not want to go over the edge of the UV island, and if we do, it will actually cause some problems when we go to use the UV transform. It will try and snap to a position that isn't there, so keep that in mind. And there we go. Go ahead and go to tool properties, make that a closed curve. All right, so that should do the trick for that area. Tighten up this corner as well. And I think I'm going to activate the mode delete here, and I'm going to delete that vertex. Just one too many verts. Okay, hit spacebar to drop the tool. And now what we can do is go back to our mop toe box. And in the merge meshes, we'll select source, type in CRV for curve, and select the toe box. Let's go see if it's created that mesh item for us. Looks like not, so we probably need to go back to the curve and then select it in poly mode, hit F for flip, and it should have created something for us now. Yeah, there we go. All right. Now let's go ahead and go back to the toe box item. Go to the curve fill mop or mesh op, and make sure everything is good in here, and it looks just fine because it came from a duplicated mesh item, so we should be good to go. One thing I do want to change here is that on the UV transform, let's turn off the push. Let's just set that to 0. We also need to go into the polygon bevel, expand that out, and then select by previous, and then make sure that it is selecting the correct thicken here. So it should be thicken 3, not thicken 2, and now everything is good to go on that panel. Now we can work on the heel guard, and we'll do the same thing that we did for the toe box. So we'll make a new mesh item for the curve, and we'll call that heel guard, and then we'll go ahead and duplicate the toe box. So we'll select it, go to item mode, and then we can duplicate that, rename the item, call this heel guard, same as the curve item. And now what we can do is open up the merge mesh source and delete that source that's in there for the toe box. And we also need to hide the front UV flat and open up the back UV flat. We can also select all of our curve items, hit Control G to group them together, and I'll rename them to, I don't know, let's see, curve group locator. We can do the same thing with all the mops that we've created. So select all of them, and we'll call this mop group locator. All right, now we can draw a curve in. Same thing as before. With the mesh constraints on to background, activate our curve tool. And this time we'll create a curve going around the opposite way, so that way it works straight out of the gate. All right, so we'll start placing some curves, or a curve, I suppose. All right, and we're on our way. All right, go to tool properties and then close that curve. Spacebar to drop the tool. Now let's go to the mop heel guard and add our source in as the curved heel guard. And if we go and look, it looks like it's snapping to the wrong place. That's because it is UV transforming to the wrong UV map. So select the UV transform mesh shop, go to target UV and say upper back, and that should automatically go right to the back. Now for the back area here, what we do want to do is use the push function, and we'll say 0.15 centimeters, so that's 1.5 millimeters. And we also need to edit the poly bevel because it's not being beveled along that thickened area. So expand out that poly bubble, go to the select by previous, make sure it's selecting the thicken number 4, and there we go. Now that we have all of our panels created, it's time to create the eyelets. And there's a really easy way to make this happen with the procedural functions in Modo. Because we already have this back panel curve created and we have our mop function created, all we need now to do is to create an internal curve. I have this little circle curve I already created, and we'll select it, copy it, then go to our back panel, and I'm going to go right over here to the side of the shoe, and I'm going to paste that in. And you can see we get our eyelet automatically updated as we pasted that in. For the rest of them, though, I am going to turn off the curve fill and UV transform and pretty much every function above that. And from here, we'll copy and paste each one and place them according to the sketch. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So select it, copy, paste, move, and then we'll rinse and repeat that. Now we can select each of these, activate the mirror tool with the Shift V key, and we'll click at approximately the middle of the flat version of the last, and we'll move them over just a little bit. Now we need to manually place each one of these as well. And also, because we use the mirror tool, it actually flipped those curves. So we want to make sure that they're facing the correct way. Otherwise, they won't patch correctly when we use the curve fill function. So select each one of these, hit the F key to flip them. And now what we can do is go back to the mop back panel, turn on curve fill and all of the corresponding mesh hops. Let's go ahead and take a look at the shoe and eyelets, and they're looking good. Now that we have the eyelets complete, we can work on some of the stitching. And there are several ways we can create stitching. The first way is to use a selection, and that's how we'll start. So make sure that we have the toe cap selected, and we want to find where the approximate stitching trough is based on the concept art. And if I recall correctly, it's this edge loop here. And now that I have that selection, let's go ahead and activate a new operator, and this one's edge bevel. And we'll set the value to about 0.5, 0.6 millimeters. And we'll add in a round level there. So that way we have an edge loop going down the middle of that. In fact, let's just set that to, we'll say 0.2 millimeters, 0.02 millimeters rather. And that should do the trick. Now we can select that edge loop that we created in there and add a push function. And we'll scale that on in about -4 millimeters. Yeah, that should do the trick. Now that we have that stitching trough in there, we can create our stitches. So we'll select that same edge that we pushed in, then come up to geometry and activate the stitch mesh tool, and it's called stitch mesh setup. So activate that. And what this does is create stitches along a curve, and it will also create the curve for you. And you can specify how that curve is created and used. So by curve source, what we wanted to do is selected edges, procedural. So that way, whenever this shape is changed on the toe cap, the stitches will follow the toe cap exactly. You could also say selected edges unlinked, and that will create a curve that is not procedurally created, and it will not follow that geometry on the toe cap. And you can also say use a new mesh, and then you would be prompted to name it, or you can say existing, and then you would be prompted to select which from this drop-down list here. So what we want is selected edges procedural. We also want to use a preset. So make sure that you have this tick box here selected, use stitch preset. So we'll hit OK, and we'll select the fat 2 millimeter stitch. Hit OK, and there we go. We have our stitching in that stitching trough. Something to also consider is that you may notice some of the stitches are pointing out along that direction, like so, and others are pointing out this direction. And to alleviate that issue, what we can do is to align it to a particular mesh. And the reason it's happening on this one is because it took the mesh for the toe cap and is using that for the alignment. And right now it's sitting inside of that trough, so it's not sure which polygon to pull from. So what we can do is select the toe cap, and we'll hit Control D to duplicate it. And I'm going to rename that right off. We'll call this toe box align. And then inside the mesh ops for this, we'll turn off push and then the edge bevel that we created inside of there. And we'll also hide that and then group it inside of a group that we shall rename to alignments. And we'll move that up here and also hide it. Now inside of the mop toe box stitch item, make sure you select that locator, and then inside of the setup here, go to the alignment mesh and select the mop toe box align. And now the stitching will point out along their correct normals. You may have also noticed that the stitches are a little bit offset incorrectly. And the easy way to do this is to modify the surface offset. And we'll go ahead and try a value of 0.02. And that looks like it'll work. Another way that you can create stitching is through using the topology tools. So let's go ahead and get that started. We'll make a new mesh and we'll call this curve, surf, constraint. And we'll activate the curve tool. And we'll go ahead and start placing topology along this panel. But one thing we might want to do just to make sure that it constrains to that panel is to hide all the other panels. So we'll expand out our mops and then hide everything but the back panel and hide the midsole too. Activate our mesh again that we want to create the curve in. And for the placement of the curve for the stitches, we'll want to place it in between the eyelets and the edge of the panel. So right along here. To ensure that the curve snaps to the surface, we either need to activate topology mode or turn on the mesh constraints. And that's right here. And then if you hold down the Alt button, click options, you can ensure that it's going to be snapping to the background mesh. And the only background mesh we have active is this panel. So as soon as we start clicking in the viewport, that vert and all other verts should be snapping to that surface. So we'll go ahead and place this. Another thing that is pretty useful is that you don't have to be all that accurate with this. And what I mean by that is we can tweak this later after we get the stitching on it. And also you don't need too many verts, because with the procedural system, we can actually rebuild this curve without any problems down the road. Just ensure that it follows the contours of the surface as best as we can. All right, let's go ahead and go back to the other side and push that forward a little bit. So now that we have that curve placed, what we can do is create another new mesh, and we'll call this one mop surf constraint. So that way it mirrors the curve version, and we know that they're linked together, so we don't delete them or anything like that. Now let's add the merge mesh. Expand this out, add the source as the curve surf constraint, and then we can hide the curve version of that. Go back to the mop version, and on top of the merge mesh, what we can do is add in a rebuild. Make sure we spell that correctly. Okay, so this is where it gets interesting. And what we want to do is either point count or minimum distance. In this case, I'm going to say 80 points, just so that way we get enough points to snap to the surface underneath. And it looks like it's doing a pretty good job of that. So next we can add another mesh hop, and this one will be surface constraint. And here's where it gets interesting. So what this will do is let us specify a mesh that we want to snap the surface to. So we'll leave this set to closest, and for the constraint surface, we want to set this to the panel here. So mop back panel, and then we'll hit OK. So now it's being constrained to the surface. It's not all that obvious because we used the topology tools initially to constrain it to the surface. Anyway, so it should be exactly where we want it to be. But just to demonstrate, what we can do is use the offset from the surface constraint. So we'll say 0.1, and you'll see that it starts to get pushed up along that surface. And also something to keep in mind, let's actually push this a bit further. We'll just say 1 centimeter. So you can see it's a little wavy. So if we turn on double-sided, we're good to go now. It's following that surface perfectly. So what we can do is just set this back to either 0 or 0.1, just temporarily. And now that we have that done, what we can do is select our mesh item for the mop surface constraint, go to geometry, activate the stitch mesh tool. We'll specify an exact curve source. So we'll say existing mesh and then point to the mop surface constraint object. We'll use the fat 2mm stitch again, so that way we have consistency between all of our stitches. Hit OK. Nothing happens. That's fine. That's most likely because our alignment mesh isn't set. So we'll set one here. And what we want to do is select that mop back panel. And there we go. Now that we have that stitching in place, what we can do, just a quick demo, is how we can actually tweak the stitching after the fact. So unlike using a procedural curve where it's generated based off of topology of something else, this one is independent and can be freely moved. So if we go into poly mode and activate that curve that we originally created, we can go in and tweak this to however we want. So if it's too close to that edge, we can back it off. If it's not close enough, we can push it closer. So it's pretty cool. Another thing that it will automatically do is, here, let's grab an area. Back here is a good example. If we pull this area down pretty far, it will automatically add in as many stitches as needed to ensure that there's no gap in the stitches. And I'll just hit undo. So that's a really useful way to place stitching exactly where you want it and get that precision that you may need. The last way I'm going to show how to create stitching is with the method that we've previously used, using UV transform to create the panels. We'll create a new mesh item. We'll call this curve UV trans. And what we need to do is create a curve over on the flat last again. So we'll activate the curve tool, make sure we have mesh constraints turned on. And there we go. I'm going to create a curve that flows from the middle top of the shoe to the middle bottom of the shoe. And we'll go ahead and start by clicking here. And I'm only going to create maybe 2 or 3 verts. That should do the trick. All right, now that we have that, let's create a new mesh item. We'll call this mop UV trans. And we'll add a merge mesh. In the source, make sure that we select the right curve. In this case, it's UV trans. And then add an operator UV trans, of course. So we'll select the last and the upper back UV, because that's the flat version we're working on here. And it should show up on the mesh over on this side. Now, like the previous stitch we did right here with the surface constraint, what we need to do is to rebuild the curve. Because it's not exactly sticking to the surface as we would like. So let's add an operator, type in rebuild. And 2 things we could do here. We could put a surface constraint after the rebuild, but it's kind of pointless because if we just move this down underneath the UV transform, we'll get the same effect. And now we have our curve there. So all we need to do now is to select that mesh item and then activate the stitch tool. Make sure that we select an existing mesh and select this mop item, which is called mop UV trans. We'll hit OK. Select the same stitch as before, the fat 2mm. Hit OK. And it's not going to show up because we don't have an alignment mesh. So make sure that we select the mop back panel. And there we go. So hopefully you found these 3 ways of creating stitching useful. Now we need to modify the tongue a little bit because, of course, not too many shoes have the tongue sticking to the rest of the shoes. So let's change that up. And the way we'll be doing that is with a deformer. So to start, we'll select the tongue item, and then we'll add in a transform effector. Okay, it's a little large, so we can go ahead and change the display size, and we'll just find something that works. Right now, it's currently pretty small, I'm guessing, so we'll say 0.2. That'll do the trick for now. And what we want to do is to place this transform effector from the point that we want to move or rotate or scale from. And that position is currently right about here on the top of the shoe, right in the center. So let's select it. And if we move it, you'll notice that the whole item moves. Make sure we turn off background constraints, so that way it doesn't snap to verts and other background items. All right. And we don't want to move the whole item. So let's hit undo. And the way that we can make sure that we only adjust the part that we want to move is to use a fall off. And the fall off will have minimal effect toward the front and more effect toward the back and top. So let's expand out this transform effector. We'll add in a fall off, and we're going to use a linear fall off. And you'll see that's created this giant fall off in our scene. And what we want to do is to move this fall off over toward the center of where that transform effector is going to be. And the reason I've added both of these without moving anything is because we want to do that in setup mode, and we might as well do that at the same time. So as we turn on setup mode, it's going to hide all of the procedural mesh items. It's not a problem. As soon as we exit setup mode, it will return. But in the meantime, we still have our stitches, and that will give us a good point of reference for where we need to place this. So let's go ahead and line it up as best as we can. Let's see. We'll start with right about there for that. And then we'll select the fall off and move it on over somewhat closely to the transform effectors locator. Also, the size of this is pretty large, so let's make it smaller. And if we click on this little arrow here, we can say the range is 0.2 or 0.5 or something to that effect. And that's going to be incredibly small. So let's just say 5. So that should make it 5 centimeters. And that might actually be pretty close to what we're going to be using. But let's just say 10 centimeters. You may have noticed as well that it transforms from the big end rather than the small end. You can change that by hitting invert. So if it's easier for you to work from the small point, which in some cases I find to be a little easier, just hit invert and you'll get that. So let's in fact just keep it that way. So that way we scale from that position whenever we need to scale or adjust the range or any other parameters of the fall off. So we'll place it fairly close to that locator for the transform effector. And now what we can do is get out of setup mode. We'll hit Shift A to focus in on that. And you may have noticed too that I aligned the fall off to the direction of the tongue in the area I want to be most affected. So that will be helpful. And we also need to move this over so that way it's a little more aligned in the center. And I'm thinking we may have moved that locator over just a little too much, but we'll see what happens. Another thing I want to do is find that sweet spot for the locator display size. So let's try, 0.05 should do the trick. And now what we can do is activate the rotation tool with the E key, and we can rotate the transform effector down. And you can see we start getting a little bit of relaxation going on with the tongue. That's pretty close to what we want, but we want a little more space in this area with the first two eyelets. So let's move the transform effector down a little bit as well, and perhaps back. And then it looks like we should probably adjust the fall off itself. And you can see the area that's being affected is moving. So let's move it to the front a little bit more. And that's pretty close to what I think we're going to need. Perhaps we'll move the locator down just a little bit more. And that should be plenty of space to place the laces into once we create them. Now it's time to work on the lacing. So the first thing that we'll do is place in a curve on top of the vamp last that's flattened out here. And we'll use the UV transform function to transpose the curve onto the last, as we've done previously with all of the panels and even some of the stitching. So let's start by creating a new mesh. We'll call it curve, laces flat, and activate the curve tool. We'll need to turn on mesh constraints and make sure it's snapped to the background. And right out of the gate, what we want to do is just place one vertex per eyelet just to make sure that our lines are straight, or laces, I should say. So let's go ahead and click add approximately in the center for each. And then we can drop the tool and go into poly mode. And what we want to do now is to finesse the shape a bit more and also add a few more vertices to control the way that it snaps onto the last, or when we use the UV transform. So select it on poly mode, go to tool properties, and then add mode. We'll start over here on the left. And the reason is because with the curve tool in add mode, if you want to add a point, it will create a point down the line starting from the beginning toward the end. And since this was the beginning, if we now click, it will add a vert in between the first and second. So let's go ahead and add 2 vertices in between each of the spans. And then also we're going to need 3 verts per eyelet. So 1 vert going in, 1 that's already in the hole, and then 1 exiting the hole. So we'll ignore the 3 verts that go in and out of that hole just for now. And we'll focus on placing the verts for the spans. And then we have the vert going in, the one existing, and the one out. And we'll just repeat this process for every eyelet. All right, now that we have all of these verts placed, let's go ahead and go back to the beginning. And the reason we're doing this one last is because it functions a little bit different adding points to the very first one, because they're always added after that first one. So what we want to do is place another vert to where the one goes in at, and then we'll do the one after, and then move the original one to the position of the one going in. So now that we have the curve all set up for this, we can drop the tool with the space bar. And similar to the paneling that we've done, we don't actually want to manipulate or control anything with the procedural system directly with this mesh item. We want to pass it through another mesh item using the merge function. So we'll create a new mesh item. We'll call this mop laces wrapped. We'll add a merge mesh function, select the source, and that should be laces flat. And then on top of this, we'll do a UV transform. Make sure we select the last again, and we'll be using the upper vamp UV. And immediately you can see that it snaps right over to where our eyelets are. And now that we have the laces on top of the shoe, what we want to do is to make sure that the laces are actually laced through the eyelets. And this part is actually the longest portion of creating a shoe procedurally. And that's something we're working on internally to shorten that. But in the meantime, this is still pretty quick, and I'll show you how to do it. So what we want to do is to make sure that alternate laces are going either out along the vamp or in. And what we need to do to make that happen is to tweak the lace at the original point. So to start, what we want to do is actually have 2 viewports, one that focuses on the shoe and one that focuses on the original flat laces. So by holding control and then left clicking on this little orange circle here, click and drag downward. And then we want to have the bottom one focus on the curve on the shoe, and then the upper one focus in on the original flat lace. And if your viewport isn't independent from one another, hit the O key over one of them, and then make sure you turn on independent center, scale, and rotation. And then you should have 2 independent viewports. So I'm going to start with the upper left eyelet here. And the other thing that we want to do before we start tweaking is to make sure that inside of the mop version of the laces, that we change a function in the UV transform that will allow us to move out and in on the z-axis on the flat version, which in turn will allow it to do what we want, and that's to go out or in based off of the local direction of the vamp. And that function is wrap to surface. So I'll show you what happens before we actually do that. And what we'll do is go into vert mode, and I'm going to activate the transform tool. Pay attention to this upper left corner right here, and nothing should happen. So we move it back and forward. Oh, and we should turn off background constraint because this is going to not require that. So you should see it moving out along that normal, but it's not doing anything currently. And if we go back to the mop laces wrapped and UV transform for that, turn off this wrap to surface, and you'll see that now that lace is popping way out. Obviously, that's not what we want, but a good example of what we do want to use it for. So let's select those verts again and bring those back. You can see they're moving right out along that normal of the shoe. So let's go ahead and actually push those back a little further, and we want those to go inward through this part of the shoe. So we need to select the next vert right here and bring that on in. We'll select the next one down and bring that over. And the ones that we moved right here need to actually go back out. So that way they go outside the eyelet. And we'll tweak the previous one again. Bring that one back a little more. And that should do it for that one. Oh, looks like that one's protruding through the shoe. There we go. So another thing that we want to do just on a global scale is each alternating overlapping lace will push one up and then one out. The easiest way to make that happen is to select one of these ends of the lace and then use the shift up arrow key to select all the way down to right there. And then we'll deselect each of the ends. So that way we only have half of the middle verts. And with the transform tool still selected, what we want to do is to bring these ones out a little bit, and we can get a better angle here just to see what's going on. So bring those out, and now we have those ones crossing over the top of the underlying part of the lace. We'll do the opposite for the other laces, or the other half anyway. So we'll select the top left and then shift up arrow until we get the other half, and then deselect with the lasso, and then bring these ones down just a tiny little bit. All right, and now we can move on with the next eyelet and basically do the exact same thing. So I'll show you one more, and then I'm going to time lapse through the rest of them. So we'll move on to the next one down the chain here. That's this guy over here on the right. So it should be that eyelet there. And this hoop needs to cross over this area here of the panel and then go downward into that eyelet and then come back and go over the next. So that means these two verts need to go back on the z-axis, and this one needs to go out. And then the following one needs to go out as well. And the next one needs to go in. And that basically needs to be repeated throughout each of the verts for the lace. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll come back after the time lapse. Now that we have the curve all tweaked and ready for the next step, what we want to do is to change the UI back to how we had it. So what we can do is delete one of these perspective views. We'll do the top. If you right click on the little orange dot, it may be black if you don't have that viewport active. So if you click in it, it will change to orange. Right click on that dot and then hit delete, and it will go back to a single view. Now we can move on to the actual creation of our geometry for the laces. And to do that, we're going to be using a tool called Geo from Curves. So we'll open up Geo from Curves. And what this will do is, it's kind of self-explanatory, but if you have a curve, select it, and then hit this new button here, it will create geometry along the curve. Similar to the stitch tool, but you can actually use profiles and other things instead of just a mesh item. So the first thing we need to do is, similar to how we fed our curve for the laces into the wrapped version, we need to take that wrapped version and feed that in through another mesh item that will then use Geo from Curves. Make a new mesh item, call this mop Geo from Curves. I'm just going to call that GFC. Add an operator, it'll be a merge meshes. Select the source, and that should be mop laces wrapped. Okay, now on top of that, we can either add an operator and find Geo from Curves, or just hit the new button here. So we'll do that with the correct item selected. And you'll notice right away that we're getting some geometry there, but it's not exactly what we're looking for. So what we can do is first add more segments, and we'll say 80 to start, and change this size to like 2 millimeters, probably a little bit bigger. We'll try 4 millimeters. That's a bit more lace sized. We may even go a little larger, but we'll see how our profile looks once we apply it. The other thing you may notice is that there are a lot of polygons facing in different directions, and that's because it's getting its direction from the curve. So that's something we can actually control with a gradient, and I'll show you how to do that a little bit later. So first thing, let's go ahead and turn on sub Ds. That's under the output for Geo from Curves. Click on this little arrow and then tick the SDS box. And the other thing we want to change is geometry type. And that is under the same drop down. We'll change this to use profile. And what we need to do is actually select the profile that we want to use. Now it doesn't show anything because we haven't specified a profile. And to do that, we need to go into the Geo from Curves item, expand this out, and there will be a source profile here. So let's click on add profile. And this one should be called profile lace. And now that we have that, you can see exactly how the laces are going to look. We can close the Geo from Curves panel. The other thing we can do is increase the size. Let's try 6 millimeters. That looks a bit more accurate. Now let's focus on the placement, the size, and the twist. And also, you know what? We should probably cap that geometry off. And there's a function for that under the output. Click on that arrow and then hit cap. And we'll do the twist one first. So click on the gear, open in editor. We'll bring this on down here. And we'll bring the lace into a better angle here as well. Now, the way that twist works is that the starting point or head of the curve is going to be 0 on the gradient editor, while the end is 100%. And what we need to do is set up keyframes for each of these eyelets. And we have 12 eyelets, so we need 12 keyframes. We'll just go ahead and start by placing a keyframe at 100, and then we'll select all these keyframes and hit Shift A to focus in on that. And we'll place 12 keyframes in between here. Then we have 12 keyframes, and what we want to do is to start up here with this one first. So what we can do is select this keyframe, click and drag, and you'll notice nothing happens. And we'll zoom out a little bit in that keyframe editor so we can get a little bit closer to 100 and 0. So to make sure that we actually affect the twist here, what we want to do is set up the twist value. And what this will do in conjunction with the gradient is actually twist it based off of the degrees you set in here. So we'll say 90 degrees, And then what the gradient editor will do is 100% will be at 90 degrees, and then 0 will be exactly where it was before. So 90 degrees should give us more or less all of the rotation that we would need to make sure that we rotate this correctly. And we'll focus in just a little bit more on the gradient editor, and we'll twist this until it gets into a position we like. And zoom out a little more. There we go. Now, the other thing too is don't be afraid to twist the beginning and end somewhere in there. And it looks like we're going to have to add some keyframes in as well. So middle click in there. And we'll move this one closer to that position. We're going to twist one more of these, and I'm going to show you something before we go too far that's going to affect all of the twist and the size. So let's move on to the next one. It should be somewhere after this. So we'll add in another keyframe. Pretty darn close. And I think we'll tweak that a little bit more. So from the tip to the second eyelet, we actually have it twisted in a way that we like. One thing though is the positioning is a little close to the other lace in this area. And the same is true in several other places. For example, right in this area here. So what we want to do is to move the curve a little bit more in those areas. And to do that, we need to go back to our flat version. So we'll turn on the flats. And then we need to find the curve for the lace again. And that is right here. We'll turn that on. We need to go into vertex mode. And we're going to need 2 viewports again. So let's control click and drag on that. And the top one will go up here. And the bottom one will go over here. So what we want to do is to move this area of the curve outward that way a little bit more. And I'll draw an arrow here. So like that. It's not a terribly complicated thing as you saw previously. So we'll go ahead and select the vertices here and activate the move tool and then push this out a little bit. Oh, looks like we have both curves selected. So what we want to do here is to move this out. And you may have noticed by doing that, it's actually affecting the twist all along the curve, regardless of what we want it to do. And that's because once you twist the position of the curve, the normals of the curve get changed. And this is something we can't currently avoid. So it's best to try and get everything in position before we start modifying the twist and scale of the laces. So we'll go ahead and go through this entire curve, get it into place, and then we'll come back and tweak the scale and twist. Another thing that we might need to do is to actually add in more divisions on the curve. So let's select the Geo from Curves item and then select the Geo from Curves mesh op. We'll add in about 40 segments, and that gets a lot closer to the shape of the curve. But if we need to, we can go even higher. So we'll say 200, and that gets us pretty close to what we need. So we'll go with 200 for now. Now that we have the curve in its relative position that we want it in, let's go ahead and modify the twist now. So bring the gradient editor back over, then select the geo from curves item, geo from curves function, and then open up the twist in the gradient editor. And we can close down this viewport so we have just one viewport. And now we can go ahead and start tweaking this in the editor. Now that we have the twist all set up, we still have a few areas where things are intersecting where we don't want them to. For example, this part of the shoelace is intersecting itself. And then we have a few eyelets. The eyelets we can tackle with scale or sizing up the gradient. So that part's not a problem. But this area right here is going to be a problem because, like we explored earlier, after you set these keyframes and then tweak the curve, it's going to change the normals and therefore change all of the twist along the entire curve. So let's tackle that real quick. Make a new viewport again. Go up to the flat version and move the gradient over. We'll focus in on this area of the shoelace. Make sure we select the flat version and go into vertex mode. And let's decide which one we want to pull out, which one we're going to pull in. So the one that goes this direction should go inward toward the shoe, and this one here should go out. On either one should do the trick, I think. Looks like we should probably rotate that area on that one as well, or twist it. So let's select that one and then bring it back and put that one forward. Go back a little bit more. It might intersect with the tongue a little bit, but that's something we can adjust with the size and twist. That should work for that area. Now let's do the same thing for the other one here. And that will work. So make sure we don't have any of the others intersecting. It looks like this one could use a little bit of twist, so we won't worry about the position so much. Yeah, that's something we can adjust with the twist and size. So I think we're good to go on the size. Let's go and delete this viewport. Bring our gradient editor back. And now we'll continue on with the time-lapse portion, and we'll return shortly. Okay, that should do it for the twist. Let's edit the size now. So we'll open that in the editor as well. And something you could do is copy and paste that curve from the twist on over to size, but it doesn't always correlate 100%. So we'll just go ahead and manually do this. And we'll place in 12 keyframes for this as well. And we'll start up here in the top left. So back to the beginning. And that should do it for the twist and scale. So right now, this is the quickest way, and really overall, it's pretty fast compared to the methods that we had to use in the past for modeling shoelaces. So that should do it for the laces. And there we go.